Hi, I'm David Powell, and I did my mapping project on gun ownership and deaths by guns in Europe. Well, here we go. Introduction to my project. Data for both gun ownership and death by guns were both comprised in the year 2007, and the data was collected through the Small Arms Survey, the World Bank, and the Health Data website that I found through the EU. And then data for gun ownership that I did not find was through the UK, Monaco, and Liechtenstein, and that also applies to death by guns. I couldn't find any data for both Monaco or Liechtenstein as well. So this is my map that I made for gun ownership in Europe, and just kind of a few aesthetics things to talk about. I have six for each of my maps. I have six categories or six color codes, and then each category has six countries within each color code. And the map didn't provide a scale, so I kind of had to play around and compare with Google Earth. And Google Earth, based on the scale that this map is scaled at, it's approximately about 200 miles. So now on to the actual data of the map for LQ ownership in Europe. We obviously see a little bit higher LQ ratio in Scandinavia and Iceland. Very explainable in terms of people are more isolated there. They depend more on the land. So that could definitely be an approximate cause for that region. And then also Germany, they have very restrictive gun laws, but yet they have a very high gun ownership as well. The region that I took out of this, especially was Eastern Europe, where they had a lower gun ownership, like in countries like Ukraine, Romania, Poland. Those countries really together have very similar gun laws and very similar gun ownership as well. Um, and this, in turn, this whole map uh, really shows that the Van Thuen's isolated state theory really comparably correlates with this map in terms of, and if you put it comparatively to Professor Wagendorf's PowerPoint presentation on the isolated state theory, Germany is a centralized location in terms of that presentation in Van Thuen's theory. Um, and we can obviously see that in terms of LQ, the higher the ownership is, the closer it is to the isolated state theory. So, and the further away it gets out in terms of lower LQ for gun ownership, the further away it is too for the theory as well. So that was just kind of interesting comparison that I got out of this map as well. So this is my final map for LQ gun ownership in Europe. So this is the highest and lowest LQ for ownership. The highest that I found was in Finland, Serbia, in Sweden, and in Germany. And the lowest were Romania, Poland, Netherlands, and Lithuania. And once again, you pull out Eastern Europe in terms of Romania, Poland, and Lithuania. But you also see the central state theory in terms of the highest, in terms of Finland, Sweden, and Germany. So these are both the lowest and highest LQs for gun ownership in Europe. In an overview of gun ownership in Europe, highest LQs are seen in Scandinavia and in Western Central Europe, so areas surrounding Germany. And in Thai compares to Van Thuen's central state theory. In lowest LQs are seen in East Central Europe, so regions like Poland, surrounding Poland, and in Western Europe, like the Ukraine area, Romania's areas, were the ones that saw the lowest LQs. Excuse me. LQs are in groups or in pockets, whether it is high or low. So that can apply to like Eastern Europe, for example. They're really pocketed together in terms of ownership. So that could really explain just in terms of gun restrictions as well. And we see regions where they're a little bit higher, where they're compact, especially Scandinavia. So like Sweden, Finland, and Norway and Iceland were really pocketed together in terms of ownership as well. So that was just another interesting comparison that I saw from the maps that I created. And then the data was not found for some countries like the UK and Switzerland. I don't know why they did not provide it through the Small Arms Survey. So they didn't provide data for either one of those countries. Um, excuse me. And most gun laws in Europe, like Germany, were very restrictive gun laws. So more so than what you would see here in America. There's a longer process to get a gun, or even areas where you can hunt. It's just more, um, it's more safe to get a gun and more cautious to get a gun in Europe. So this is the map I made for deaths by guns in Europe. Um, so we also now see that we see a vice versa effect for Eastern Europe, where they have a higher LQ death by guns in Europe, where they had lower gun ownership. So we kind of also see the Van Thielen's isolated state central theory in Germany, but now in turn vice versa, being a lower LQ's deaths by guns instead of being the higher end of things. So we kind of see that Van Thielen's isolated state theory again in terms of pattern. And now the thing that I got out of it as well was Southern Europe, where Serbia, Macedonia, and Albania, those countries were formerly of Yugoslavia. So obviously there's going to be some tension still within that region in terms of just their problems that they have. So this is the map that I made for deaths by guns in Europe. These are the highest and lowest LQs for deaths by guns. Albania actually was a very interesting one to look at because I further researched why they had such a LQ ratio, more so almost being 10 points above Montenegro. But I did read an article online regarding Albania's death by guns rate, and it's actually twice of that in the U.S. So all the stuff that we see in the U.S., that's approximately twice as much happening in Albania. Now Albania is a very small country compared to the United States. So this is a very surprising LQ ratio to look at. And just to finish out the highest LQs, Serbia and Macedonia, and all those countries altogether were a part or related to the former Yugoslavia. So there's definitely a pattern there, a correlating pattern. And the lowest ones were in Iceland, UK, Hungary, and Germany. So we go back to Van Thielen's isolated state theory again. Really those centralized countries like the UK, Iceland, Germany, being closer to that central state. In Iceland as well, to take a note, because they have they have the lowest LQ death by guns, but they also have a very high gun ownership as well. And that could be explained through possibly by a lot of people in Iceland living off the land as well. So these are the highest and lowest LQs for deaths by guns. An overview of deaths by guns in Europe. Deaths are higher in Southern Europe, so like areas in Serbia, Albania, and in Eastern Europe, like the Romania, Ukraine areas. Excuse me. And a lower amount of deaths in Scandinavia, in Western Europe, so like Spain area, Portugal areas, they had a lower amount of deaths in terms of those areas. And we also see, again, bigger pockets of LQs, but more sporadic. So like Southern Europe being a huge pocket of higher death by guns. And it kind of relates to Eastern Europe as well. But we also see more sporadic, less correlating data within the death by guns LQs. And there's a very distinct pattern, like I mentioned, between Greece, Serbia, Romania, Ukraine, Albania, Montenegro. All those countries have very high death by gun rates. So this is the overview. And in a side-by-side comparison, we can definitely see Van Thielen's isolated state theory really being comparable to these maps in Germany, Scandinavia, Iceland, France, Belgium. Those countries had higher LQs And then in turn, vice versa, Germany, parts of Scandinavia, Iceland, the UK, they all had lower death by gun rates. So that's very correlating with the Van Thuen's isolated state theory. And then there is also a vice versa effect in terms of ownership and death by guns in Eastern Europe. So ownership in Eastern Europe was very, very low, but the death by guns were very, very high. And that also stays true with southern part of Europe, although the southern part of Europe had a slightly higher LQ ratio for gun ownership. So this is a side-by-side comparison of both maps. And in comparison between the two, gun ownership and death by guns, many countries followed a pattern. So like Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, they all followed a very distinct pattern, and either through gun ownership or through death by guns. And the patterns did vary by region, so like Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and in Northern Europe like Germany, Netherlands. And Serbia is a prime example of high ownership with high deaths by guns. And Iceland is another example of high gun ownership and deaths by guns, low deaths by guns, and that could stay true with Scandinavia as well. The Netherlands were a great example of low gun ownership and low deaths by guns. And in turn, they're one of the better countries in the world. They're one of the best planned countries in the world. So maybe that is something that that is explainable through both the low gun ownership and low death by guns. And I do believe that the breakup of the Yugoslavia still has an effect on the death by guns and ownership in Southern Europe today. Unexpected and expected results. I did expect Scandinavia and Iceland, including within that, with high gun ownership with their gun laws that they currently have. And I didn't expect Southern Europe to have a higher LQ for deaths by guns. I expected Greece to have a higher death by guns, but I didn't expect that all of Yugoslavia or former Yugoslavia to have combined really together within a region to have high death by guns. And then Iceland, again, had a high ownership and low death by guns, and I didn't really expect that. So, in conclusion, there were no definite results that showed a correlation between high gun ownership and high death rates by gun, and vice versa. So I can't really come to conclusion that guns causes higher death rates in terms of gun-related crimes, or that that low or higher death by guns necessarily means lower gun ownership. So this is definitely one reason why I chose this project, is because that's one of the more lingering questions that we have today in American politics, whether we should have very restrictive gun control laws or whether we should totally ban them or leave it the way it is. Just based on this mapping project alone, it's too sporadic to tell. There were too many different kind of results, like the Iceland example, where they had high ownership, but they also had low death by guns. But you can also look at Albania, where they had high ownership, but also very high death by guns. So you can't really come to the conclusion that guns really mean something. So that's kind of what I got out of it. And lots of the data was a surprise. Like I mentioned, in Iceland, Southern Europe, those areas were definitely surprising to me. And data was patterned by region, and it very closely tied to that Van Thuen's isolated state theory, being centralized in Europe, and very correlating as terms as you go out from that central state. And then finally, much of the data could be traced to the Van Thuen's isolated state theory. So this is my project that I did on both gun ownership and death by guns in Europe. Thanks for listening, and I hope to hear feedback from you. Thanks. Bye.